Hey guys, tonight let's dim the lights, get comfortable, and wander down one of history's darker little alleyways. Don't worry, we're not doing anything too loud or exciting. In fact, it's the perfect kind of story to help you drift off. Because nothing says bedtime quite like the strange, sad, and often awkward afterlives of medieval and early modern executioners. Yes, the men who swung the axes, tightened the ropes, and generally made sure justice, or something pretending to be justice, got served. You'd think after doing such a messy public service they'd be rewarded with gold, glory, or maybe even a nice cottage with a garden. But no. Their lives were usually just as grim, if not weirder, after they hung up their swords and ropes. So tonight, we're going to float through their world. We'll look at how these men were needed, feared, and then quietly pushed to the margins when people didn't want to think about them anymore. And as you'll see, their retirement plans ranged from lonely fishing in muddy rivers to desperate attempts at blending into towns that never really accepted them. Some even ended up running taverns because apparently nothing eases the memory of public beheadings quite like pouring weak beer for grumpy farmers. Executioners were basically medieval trash collectors, if the trash happened to be human lives. Everyone knew the work had to be done, but nobody really wanted to touch it. In most towns, being the hangman wasn't a job you applied for. It was one you sort of fell into, usually because you had already done something bad. Cities often forced convicted criminals to take the role. It was, ironically, a way of sparing their life. Congratulations, you're not being executed today. Instead, you get to execute other people for the rest of your life. Imagine being hired at a company where the only job interview question is, would you like to kill people in exchange for not dying yourself? And it wasn't like they were welcomed afterward. Executioners lived at the edge of town, literally. They were required to live outside city walls, in little cottages or farmsteads, as if their very presence could contaminate the clean moral air of the townsfolk. You could drink their beer, you could watch them chop heads, but heaven forbid you let your daughter marry their son. This stigma was deep. Executioners were considered untouchables in many parts of Europe. People believed the job stained their very soul. They were denied communion in some churches. They couldn't join guilds. They couldn't run for office unless the office was, I don't know, chief local disappointment. Their kids inherited this weird social exile too. If your father had been the hangman, good luck finding a respectable trade. You might learn butchery or tanning, because those were also unclean professions. But no, you weren't going to be a goldsmith. The town wasn't about to let someone with blood-soaked family history near their wedding rings. And yet, here's the twist. Everyone also wanted them around. You needed someone to do the job, and you wanted them to do it well, because as much as people came to watch executions for the public spectacle, nobody enjoyed a messy, botched beheading. Nothing ruins a Saturday morning market execution like 3 failed axe swings and a screaming prisoner who won't die politely. So, executioners were stuck in this awkward paradox, hated but necessary, which is kind of the story of most middle managers today, but let's not get too modern. So what happened when an executioner grew too old, too shaky, or too drunk to keep chopping heads? That's where things get especially interesting and especially sad. Unlike a knight or a clerk, there wasn't really a retirement plan. You didn't get a pension. Nobody clapped you on the back after 40 years of service and handed you a shiny watch. You were just done. And when you're done, society doesn't exactly want you hanging around. You're not going to fade into a respectable old age telling grandchildren about the good old days on the scaffold. People remembered what you did, and they weren't about to let you forget it. Some retired executioners tried to shift careers. Common choices included running a tavern, becoming a low-level healer, or, hilariously, trying their hand at fortune-telling. Imagine showing up to get your palm read and realizing it's being done by the guy who chopped off your cousin's head last year. Talk about bad vibes. Others ended up moving from town to town, basically begging for work or hoping to find another community willing to take them in. But the social stain followed them everywhere. You could travel 100 miles, and people would still point and whisper, "That's the guy who killed half the people we gossip about." One of the strangest second lives came in the form of medicine. Believe it or not, Executioners were often thought to have special healing powers. This sounds weird until you remember how medieval minds worked. If you were constantly surrounded by death, you must know something about life, right? Executioners sometimes collected fat, bones, and blood from their victims. Yes, it's gross, but stay with me. These materials were thought to have healing properties. Hangman's grease, made from the fat of executed criminals, was rubbed onto wounds and arthritis pains. Drinking fresh blood from a beheaded man, supposedly a cure for epilepsy. Nothing like chugging warm criminal juice to stop your seizures. And who was the guy best positioned to provide these delightful remedies? That's right, the executioner. Some retired from chopping heads only to set up shop as amateur pharmacists, selling jars of human goo to eager customers. The irony, of course, is that people who wouldn't shake their hand in the market were more than happy to pay for a bottle of powdered skull if they thought it would make their gout feel better. It's hard not to see the hypocrisy here. Society pretended executioners were dirty, untouchable outcasts until they wanted a free sample of authentic hangman medicine. Classic double standard. We also have names. These weren't just faceless nobodies. One of the most famous was Franz Schmidt, the Nuremberg executioner in the late 1500s. Schmidt was basically the LeBron James of beheading. He was professional, clean, and even kept a diary of his executions, which is equal parts fascinating and horrifying. He performed over 350 executions in his career, which, to be fair, was more job stability than most peasants ever got. But what's really interesting is that when he retired, Schmidt became a respected healer. Yes, after decades of killing people. He flipped careers and became a kind of local doctor, patching up the sick and wounded. And the wild part, people actually respected him for it. His reputation as a healer eventually outweighed his career as a killer, which is sort of like if Jack the Ripper had retired and opened a popular dentist's office. Of course, Schmidt was an exception. Most executioners didn't get such a smooth career pivot. Many ended up poor, drunk and bitter, living out their final years in shabby huts, occasionally reminding passers-by that yes, they were once the law's sharpest instrument. Nobody cared. Executioners also had to clean up after executions. That might sound obvious, but think about it. When the axe falls and the crowd cheers, who's left holding the bloody mess? Yep. And it didn't just stop at cleaning. They often had to dispose of the bodies, sometimes even boiling them, quartering them, or nailing heads to spikes. Now imagine doing that for 20 years, then trying to retire quietly. How do you ever get rid of that reputation? People see you carrying your groceries and still picture you swinging an axe at dawn. It's not exactly the kind of past that fades with age. The bigger point here is that executioners were liminal figures. They lived at the edges of society, sometimes literally, always metaphorically. They were insiders enough to be useful, but outsiders enough to be despised. And when their usefulness ended, they often had nowhere to go. Some tried farming, others wandered, a few slipped into crime themselves, which honestly makes sense. If you've been killing for the state your whole life, sliding into banditry isn't much of a moral downgrade. And many simply faded into obscurity, remembered only when people whispered about the hangman's cottage on the edge of town, now overgrown with weeds. Let's pause here and take a gentle breath. That was a lot of bleakness, I know. But don't worry, we're not done. In fact, we're only beginning. Because next, we'll drift into even stranger territory. The bizarre privileges executioners sometimes enjoyed. The perks of the job that nobody talks about, and how those perks shaped their awkward retirements. So, where were we? Ah yes, the lonely afterlives of executioners. As strange as their social exile was, things get even more bizarre when we start looking at the perks of the job. Because, surprisingly, being a professional killer sometimes came with a few unexpected benefits. Not glamorous ones, mind you. No gold-trimmed carriages or velvet robes, but little privileges that, in their own warped way, made the role slightly more bearable. And sometimes, those perks spilled into retirement, shaping how these men were remembered long after their axe was put away. One of the main privileges was free goods and services. Towns often gave executioners free bread, free beer, or free meat. It wasn't generosity. It was bribery by another name. Bakers and butchers didn't exactly want to be on the bad side of the man who killed people for a living. So, to smooth things over, they'd hand him a free loaf or a few sausages. Was it friendship? Not at all. It was self-preservation, wrapped in a bread crust. And of course, this created awkward situations. Once the executioner retired, imagine trying to explain that the only reason your pantry was always full was because everyone was secretly terrified of you. The moment you stopped working, the free beer stopped flowing. Suddenly, you're just an unemployed old man with a reputation, and the butcher doesn't send over steaks anymore. Executioners also had a peculiar claim to lost property. If someone was executed, their possessions were often confiscated, and the executioner could get first pick. Now, don't imagine piles of treasure. Most of the time it was shabby coats, dented mugs, or maybe a goat that had seen better days. But for a man on the edge of society, it was something. Some hangmen built a small side income selling these confiscated odds and ends. Others were less subtle, basically turning into medieval hoarders with cottages full of second-hand junk, each piece with a story darker than anyone wanted to admit. Retired executioners sometimes ended up trying to live off these accumulated scraps, which made their homes look less like cozy cottages and more like discount graveyards of other people's misfortune. Another strange privilege was that executioners were sometimes allowed to run brothels. The reasoning went like this. The job was dishonorable, so any extra income they earned had to come from other dishonorable professions. And in medieval logic, running a tavern or a brothel was dishonorable enough to fit perfectly. So yes, there were cases where the man who beheaded traders by day rented out rooms to traveling merchants by night. You could say it was a family business, just not one most families bragged about at Sunday dinner. After retirement, some kept this trade going because it was the only livelihood they were permitted to have. Nothing says peaceful old age like pouring cheap ale while dodging insults from half-drunk customers who can't decide if they fear you or despise you. There's also the matter of executioner's touch. People believed that being touched by an executioner could bring good luck or even cure disease. Yes, the same man everyone avoided in the market was also thought to have magical hands. Children with hernias were sometimes brought to executioners to be cured by a gentle pat. Couples who wanted luck in their marriage might sneakily ask the hangman to bless them. It's a bit like hating your neighbor for being creepy, but still letting him fix your Wi-Fi when it breaks. Once again, this followed executioners into retirement. Even after they stopped working, people occasionally knocked on their doors, half ashamed, half hopeful, asking for a healing touch or a charm. The irony is exhausting, really. Shunned in public, but useful in secret. A man could live his whole life without friends, yet strangers kept coming to him for help when desperation set in. Some executioners actually leaned into this contradiction and became quasi-holy figures. It sounds ridiculous, but if enough people believe you have supernatural powers, you may as well play the part. There are records of retired hangmen setting themselves up as healers or wise men, earning small fees from villagers who otherwise wouldn't let them sit at the same table. The line between feared outcast and respected miracle worker was so thin, it shifted with the wind. One day you're the devil's butcher, the next you're the community's last hope against arthritis. Human beings are wonderfully inconsistent that way. Now, speaking of inconsistency, let's not forget how executioners were often forced into their roles in the first place. Many were criminals who had their death sentences commuted on the condition they took up the job, which means that technically society kept criminals alive so they could legally kill other criminals. A strange logic loop if there ever was one. Retirement for these men was even harder, because they already had a criminal past shadowing them before the hangman stigma got layered on top. If a man tried to farm or open a small inn, whispers would spread. Wasn't he once a thief, then a hangman, and now he's selling cabbages? It was like wearing 3 different scarlet letters at once. No wonder so many slid back into petty crime when old age caught up with them. Sometimes being feared and hated was easier than being pitied. But let's drift back to the odd privileges, because one of the most unusual was that executioners often had special seats at public events. They weren't sitting up front with the nobles, of course. But they had designated spaces, both so they could be kept separate from respectable folk, and so they could be called on quickly if needed. Imagine being at a medieval fair, sipping a watered-down ale and spotting the executioner in his corner seat, waiting like the world's most morbid substitute teacher. After retirement, that seat would be empty, and the absence would be noticed. The man was missed, but only as a function, not as a neighbor, not as a friend, just as the guy who kept order in the ugliest way possible. The children of executioners had a particularly strange inheritance. Some families managed to keep the role in a hereditary line, passing the job down from father to son. This made the family both stable and cursed. On one hand, the job provided steady income. On the other, you were locked into a life where no respectable person wanted to touch you with a 10-foot pole. Retired executioners sometimes lived long enough to see their sons take their place, watching the cycle repeat, unable to break it. Imagine growing old, sitting on a rickety stool outside your cottage, watching your boy sharpen the same axe you once used, knowing he'll live the same lonely existence. Not exactly a heartwarming family legacy. And then there were the executioners, who became local legends after death. People whispered stories about them, half horrified, half fascinated. Their names were remembered in tavern tales, usually exaggerated beyond recognition. The truth of their retirement years was often much more mundane: sickness, poverty, a few odd jobs. But people preferred the myth of the sinister old hangman who haunted his village long after his axe had gone blunt. Some were said to linger as ghosts, because of course they were. If anyone was destined to wander restlessly in the afterlife, it was the man who'd spent his earthly years swinging a blade for the city council. It's worth pausing for a moment to consider just how hypocritical this whole setup was. Medieval society loudly shamed executioners, treated them like diseased dogs, and yet couldn't live without them. People spat in their direction but still turned up in droves to watch their work. They excluded them from churches but happily paid for their folk medicines. They wouldn't let their children marry into the family, but they lined up to rub their ailments with hangman's grease. And when these men finally retired, everyone acted as if they had never existed, quietly, erasing the part they'd played in keeping order. It was a collective amnesia, as if society wanted the dirty work done but didn't want to admit who had done it. The reality of their later years was usually much less dramatic than the whispers. A retired executioner often ended up as a farmer, scratching at bad soil, or a tavern keeper pouring drinks he couldn't afford to drink himself. Sometimes they lived in small cottages that decayed faster than they did, shunned by their neighbors, visited only when someone was desperate enough to believe in the healing touch of an old killer. Occasionally they managed to reinvent themselves, like Franz Schmidt, turning into healers or even respected townsmen. But those were rare exceptions. More often they simply faded away, their names recorded only in dusty court registers or in the cruel jokes of villagers. It's a lonely picture. And perhaps that's the strangest irony of all. These men had lived lives surrounded by crowds that gathered to watch them, cheer them, jeer them, sometimes throw rotten vegetables at them. But their retirements were quiet, isolated, almost invisible. From the center of public spectacle to the margins of society, all in the span of a few years, forgotten, except for the occasional late-night story about the hangman who once lived in that crooked house by the river. Take another slow breath. That's enough bleak irony for now. But don't worry, the story isn't over yet. We still have more ground to cover. Because if you thought retirement for executioners was strange, just wait until you hear how some of them tried to reinvent themselves completely by stepping into roles society never imagined for them. We'll float into that next. So let's settle back in. We've talked about the stigma, the strange privileges, and the awkward retirement routines. But some executioners didn't just fade into farming or tavern keeping. Some, believe it or not, tried to reinvent themselves in entirely new ways. And the results were usually as bizarre as you'd expect when a man who spent decades decapitating people suddenly decides he's going to be a respectable member of the community. One path, as we touched on before, was medicine. But let's expand on that, because it wasn't just a passing fad. In many towns, the executioner really was considered part of the local healthcare system. Imagine for a moment being ill in 16th century Germany. You've got a fever, or maybe a lump on your arm that looks like it's plotting your demise. You've tried the barber surgeon, you've prayed in church, and you've rubbed some herbs on it. Nothing works. So who do you go to? The man who cut off 30 thieves' hands last year, obviously. Because why not trust the local killer to heal you? And these men didn't just rely on their reputation for magic. Some of them actually learned practical medicine. Franz Schmidt, again, is the prime example. He kept meticulous records, not only of executions but also of the patients he treated. He performed minor surgeries, set broken bones, and dispensed herbal remedies. He was, in many ways, more reliable than some of the officially trained physicians of his day, which tells you a lot about the state of medicine in the 16th century. If the hangman was your best medical option, things weren't exactly going well, but Schmidt was exceptional. For most executioners turned healers, it was more about the symbolism than the science. People believed they had absorbed mysterious knowledge from standing so close to death, and so they were trusted with charms, potions, and cures. It was a strange reversal. Once feared as dealers of death, they could become respected as guardians of life. Until, of course, they botched a cure, and then the whispers about their cursed touch came back louder than ever. A fragile career built on shaky ground. Others tried their hand at entertainment. Yes, really. There are scattered stories of executioners who joined traveling fairs or circuses, performing tricks or showing off curiosities collected from their grim careers. A hangman displaying the sword he once used on a famous nobleman could draw a crowd. Was it dignified? Not remotely. But when society pushes you to the edges, sometimes you have to lean into being a curiosity. Retired executioners became living relics, half men, half spectacles, preserved only as reminders of a world people preferred to keep at arm's length. And then there were the taverns. Many hangmen opened taverns after retirement, partly because that was one of the few trades they were permitted to run. A tavern run by a former executioner must have been an interesting place to drink. On the one hand, you might get a discount if you kept quiet. On the other, every pint came with the uneasy knowledge that the man pouring your beer once cut someone's throat with official approval. Did it make the ale taste stronger? Perhaps. Or maybe people drank faster, just to leave before the hangman started telling stories about his good old days at the scaffold. And yes, they did tell stories. Executioners were, in a sense, the keepers of public memory. They saw everything. Every trial, every punishment, every nobleman who tried to bribe his way out of the noose. They carried those stories with them, and when the ale flowed, so did their memories. For villagers who lived ordinary, uneventful lives, listening to a retired executioner must have been like tuning into a grim medieval gossip channel. Oh, you think your neighbor's a scandal? Let me tell you about the Duke I once saw weep like a child before the axe fell. It was entertainment, in the darkest possible flavor. The trouble was, not everyone wanted those stories told. Authorities sometimes forbade retired executioners from talking too much about their past, fearing it would undermine respect for the law. And neighbors who wanted to forget their town's darker moments resented the reminders. So, many hangmen learned to keep quiet, bottling up decades of violent memories, with only their own family to hear them, which couldn't have been easy, especially when their children were expected to carry on the trade. That brings us back to those families, because it's hard to overstate how much the profession shaped them. Imagine being born into a household where your father is the hangman. Other kids won't play with you, teachers might avoid you, priests hesitate to bless you. Your last name itself becomes a curse. And yet, in some cases, you're expected to grow up and take on the role yourself. It wasn't just a job, it was a family legacy, passed down like a farmer's land or a blacksmith's forge. Except instead of plowing fields or shaping metal, you're hanging thieves and quartering traders. Not exactly something you brag about at the family reunion. For those children who didn't follow the path, life was often just as hard. A hangman's daughter might struggle to marry. A hangman's son might end up with no respectable apprenticeship. Some became wanderers, drifting from town to town in search of anyone willing to overlook their bloodline. and the retired executioner himself would often carry the guilt of having passed down not just stigma, but a life sentence of exclusion. It's hard to imagine a lonelier retirement than watching your children suffer for the work you once did to survive. But despite all this misery, executioners were sometimes envied. Not openly, of course, but they earned more than many peasants, and they had a certain grim authority. People might spit at them, but they didn't dare attack them. A retired executioner, even in his old age, carried an aura of danger. He might be weak and poor, but no one quite trusted that the old man couldn't still slit a throat if pushed. It was a strange kind of power, twisted and bitter, but power nonetheless. And in societies where peasants lived under constant vulnerability, that hint of power, even in disgrace, was something people noticed. Some even tried to turn that power into politics. There are rare cases of executioners or their children holding minor offices in small towns, usually when no one else wanted the job. A hangman as town constable or guard captain wasn't ideal, but sometimes practicality won over prejudice. And for a brief moment, a retired executioner could feel almost respectable, standing at the edge of law and order without a rope in his hand. Of course, it rarely lasted. Prejudice always crept back in. One bad decision, one unlucky rumor, and the old stigma returned stronger than ever. If there's a pattern here, it's this. Retirement for executioners was never really retirement. Their old work followed them, stamped into their names, their faces, their families. You couldn't just put down the axe and walk away. People remembered. People whispered. People pointed. Even when they begged you for medicine or drank in your tavern or listened to your stories, they never forgot who you had been. That kind of work leaves a permanent mark, whether you want it to or not. And maybe that's why so many executioners ended their days quietly, out of sight, living half-lives in cottages by rivers, surrounded by weeds and silence. They had lived in the center of crowds, but in retirement, they were left with solitude. Sometimes respected, sometimes feared, but rarely loved. History doesn't record their deaths with much detail. They slipped away as quietly as they had lived loudly, their names blending into the margins of town records, their houses collapsing into ruins, their legacies reduced to ghost stories told by people who never knew them. Take another deep breath. That was a heavy drift, wasn't it? But the strangeness doesn't end there, because if you thought we'd exhausted the weirdness of executioners' afterlives, there's still one more layer. The way society used their very bodies, even after death, as symbols and tools. Yes, even in death, executioners couldn't escape their role. And that is where we'll float next. We've wandered through their strange privileges, their awkward retirements, and their children's cursed inheritance. But what about after the executioners themselves finally died? You might hope, after a life spent surrounded by blood, fear, and exclusion, that death would at least bring a little peace, a simple grave, a few prayers, maybe even some quiet dignity. Unfortunately, no. Medieval and early modern society had a way of making sure executioners remained outcasts, even in the grave. In many towns, executioners weren't allowed to be buried in consecrated ground. The churchyard was for the respectable dead. Farmers, merchants, knights, and the occasional noble who had bribed the priest to overlook a lifetime of sins. But the hangman? He was placed outside, literally beyond the cemetery wall. His body was considered too tainted, too polluted, to rest among the ordinary dead, which of course made the whole business of Christianity's forgiveness look a bit shaky. Everyone was supposed to be equal before God, but apparently God drew the line at the man who swung the rope. This meant that executioners' graves were often lonely, unmarked, and easily forgotten. A crooked cross here, a pile of stones there, usually trampled by cattle before long. And so, even in death, the executioner remained on the margins, resting in the same kind of exile he had endured in life. Neighbors who had cheered his work in the marketplace could now comfortably forget his name altogether. But people didn't forget entirely, because where there is social exclusion, there are also rumors. Executioners' graves became the subject of ghost stories. People whispered that their spirits wandered at night, unable to rest because of the sins they had committed. Some said the ghost of a hangman would return to watch over the scaffold long after his death, making sure his old post was still in use. Others said they haunted the fields around their homes, appearing as dark figures that frightened farmers' children. Was any of it true? Almost certainly not. But people liked to imagine that a man so tied to death couldn't possibly have a peaceful afterlife. It was society's final way of punishing him, projecting eternal unrest onto someone who had never been allowed to rest in life. In some towns, relics of executioners themselves were preserved, just as they had once collected the fat bones and blood of executed criminals. Now people sometimes collected parts of the hangman, a finger bone, a strand of hair, even the wood from his coffin. These could be sold as charms or talismans. The irony here is almost unbearable. The very man whose touch was considered polluting while alive could become, in death, a source of magical protection. People who had once crossed the street to avoid him now carried pieces of him in little pouches, convinced it would keep away illness or bad luck. Not every executioner had such a grim ending. A few, like Franz Schmidt, actually managed to secure decent burials. Schmidt's reputation as a healer earned him enough respect to be buried properly. His death was noted with some dignity, and his name lived on in official records as more than just a killer. But those were the rare exceptions. For most, their names were erased as quickly as possible, their graves unmarked, their bodies forgotten. The state had used them, squeezed every drop of labor out of them, and then discarded them without a second thought. And yet, here's the strangest twist. Some executioners became folk heroes after death. Stories circulated of executioners who had shown mercy at the scaffold, or who had stood up to corrupt judges. Their names were turned into half-legendary figures, the way children whisper about Robin Hood or local saints. One town might remember their hangman as cruel, while another remembered him as fair and even kind. In these cases, the executioner lived on in memory not as a monster, but as a flawed human who had done a dirty job because someone had to. It didn't happen often, but when it did, it gave the role a strange kind of dignity. A legacy forged not in spite of the blood, but because of how it was handled. Of course, these kinder stories often said more about the needs of the living than about the dead. Towns wanted to feel that their history was a little less ugly, so they painted their executioner in softer colors. They wanted to believe that the man who swung the axe was also capable of kindness, because that made the whole spectacle of public death easier to swallow. It's human nature to sand down the rough edges of the past, and executioners, as permanent fixtures of civic life, were prime candidates for this kind of historical smoothing. But let's not romanticize too much. The majority of executioners slipped into death as quietly as possible, their names remembered only by tax collectors and court scribes. Their families often left the town soon after, trying to shake off the stigma. And within a generation, the hangman's cottage might be abandoned, his tools rusting in a corner, his memory reduced to a vague curse people muttered under their breath. "Don't end up like the hangman," was warning enough. No need for details. This cycle, needed. Despised, forgotten, defined not just their lives but their deaths. Society relied on them, then discarded them, then turned their memory into a mix of fear and curiosity. And it's hard not to see the cruelty in that. Executioners had lived in constant contradiction. They were shunned, but sought after, hated, but depended upon, mocked, but secretly envied. And even when they died, the contradictions lingered. Their bodies were impure, but their bones could heal. Their souls were cursed, but their legends could comfort. They were erased from memory, yet they haunted it. Every so often, archaeologists stumble across a grave believed to belong to an executioner. These finds are always strange. The skeleton is usually isolated, often buried with unusual care but far from the rest of the community. Sometimes execution tools are found nearby, as if the man couldn't be separated from his profession even in death. The bones themselves often show signs of hard labor. Thickened joints, broken ribs, scars of old injuries, evidence of lives spent in rough work. carrying out punishments, handling bodies. The skeleton tells a story no one wrote down, that of a man who carried society's violence in his own body until it wore him down. It's haunting in a quiet way. These men lived lives of noise, crowds shouting, drums beating, swords flashing, and then died into silence, remembered only as shadows. The world moved on without them. And yet here we are, centuries later, talking about them again, their lives still echoing faintly through the cracks of history. Perhaps that's the closest they'll ever get to immortality. Not sainthood, not respect, but a strange kind of afterlife as curiosities in the great museum of human oddities. And maybe that's fitting. Executioners were never meant to be remembered as heroes or villains, but as necessary inconveniences. They were the blunt instruments of justice, wielded and then discarded. Their retirements were awkward, their deaths were lonely, and their memories were uncomfortable. But they were also human, stumbling through the contradictions forced upon them, trying to carve out some semblance of dignity in a world that refused to grant it. So, as we let this part drift to a close, imagine the quiet of their endings. A cottage collapsing under ivy. A grave beyond the cemetery wall. A name scratched out of the parish book. No grand endings, no statues, no songs. Just silence, which, perhaps, after a lifetime of noise and blood, was the closest thing to peace they could get. Take another slow breath. Let your eyes grow heavy. Because while our journey through the afterlives of executioners is almost over, there's still one more thread to follow. How their role as outcasts shaped wider society's obsession with punishment, shame, and control. That we'll wander into next.